Hello. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the ways in which self-interest, greed, and profiteering undermine disaster aid efficacy. I want to emphasize that in this lecture, what we're going to be focused on is how the micro-level decisions made by disaster aid workers and related actors, some of which serve their self-interest, ultimately end up in macro-level structures that do not serve the society as a whole. As such, we're going to be talking a lot about what these micro motivations are. When we are doing social analysis, it is very important that we attribute decision making to agents that can actually make decisions, like people or directors of an NGO or CEO of a business. So we'll be focused on analysis that are sensible and logically possible. Let's continue to the next couple of slides to talk more about this. In this lecture, I'm going to be drawing from a range of scholars who are highly critical of disaster aid. I just want this to be very clear about the boundaries of analysis that are considered in this course. We are looking at some books, for instance, Alex de Waal, who is a scholar that has worked extensively in the developing world. His book, Famine Crimes, Politics, and the Disaster Relief Industry in Africa is one of the pieces of scholarship that we'll be drawing from here. Another one is Capitalizing on Catastrophe, Neoliberal Strategies and Disaster Reconstruction, which is written by a bunch of anthropologists who conduct local and ethnographic work on disaster sites. We will be also mentioning in passing a book by Naomi Klein, Shock Doctrine, Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And this book is not a piece of academic scholarship, but a popular scholarship that is really hugely popular and has made huge impact when thinking about disasters. So it is also important to mention works that are popular as well. But for the most part, we will be sticking with academically oriented works like Disasters Without Borders by John Hannigan. Now, the critique of the motivations of the disaster aid industry is an interesting political case because the critique comes from both ends of the political spectrum. That is, people on the far left are very suspicious of the self-interest and motivations of corporations, nonprofit organizations, and government that do disaster aid. But similarly, on the far right, we have people like Rand Paul who feels like disaster aid and other forms of development aid should cease to exist because they do not do good. In some ways, the questions that we are going to be exploring in this lecture are questions that unify both the right and the far left, something that we don't see very often. I also want to acknowledge that there are some thinkers on the far right and the far left that might veer into terrain that we might consider conspiracy theorist terrain. And I want to make very, very clear to you that I think we're going to stay very far away from conspiracy theories in this lecture. And we're going to do that by first going into closely examining scholarship and journalism that has been established in these areas. We're going to keep our analysis at the level of individuals and therefore steer clear conspiracy theories away. Caveats, let's launch into this lecture itself. I'm sure you're all very interested in what the content is going to be after all those caveats. One thing that is important to recognize is that disasters need big spending. There is, of course, spending in the prevention of disasters, but really, in comparison to that kind of spending that goes on after disaster, is really minor. After a disaster occurs, there is a huge amount of money that is spent providing aid to the victims, and in particularly in the phase of reconstruction. That is, if buildings, businesses, and homes have been decimated, and all of those things need to be rebuilt. And for every dollar or pound spent, there is someone whose business is benefiting. Because disasters mean big spending, it also means that disaster prevention and disaster reconstruction are inexplicably intertwined with the self-interest of the people who are financially benefiting from them. In fact, because of this tendency for most of the money spent around disasters to be spent on reconstruction and rehabilitation, some scholars have said that there is little to no monetary incentive to really prevent disasters. Let's take a look at this argumentative packet for a moment. When we look at incidents at the cycle of disaster management that we see here, the kinds of activities that are organized around prevention, mitigation, and preparedness are typically not big dollar items. We might be thinking about creating an excavation plan, doing a disaster drill. We may be talking about including housing codes to ensure that houses are built up to the code. But all of these things are things that don't involve in a particular large investments in a new infrastructure. In contrast, when we look at the moment after a disaster strikes, we can see in the immediate relief phase a huge amount of resources being distributed. We are talking about food, medicine, clothing, temporary housing, or other forms of disaster aid. After that, there is a very long period of reconstruction and rehabilitation in which you will see everything that has been destroyed needs to be rebuilt. In this case, we're talking about major contracts being granted to build infrastructure, electricity, water, roadways, airports, housing, businesses. All of those things need to be rebuilt. And of course, everyone who is involved stands to benefit. Analysts who have looked at this tendency have really questioned that perhaps one of the reasons we do not see much support in disaster capacity building for prevention and preparedness is maybe that people are not really incentivized to prepare for disasters. And there is a greater economic incentive to some powerful actors in society to get involved in the reconstruction phase. My own position on this is that there is no one behind closed doors that are greedily rubbing their hands and hoping that a disaster strikes. I don't really believe that there are these greedy actors in societies who really want to see massive death and massive destruction. But I do believe that there are smaller and yet meaningful ways in which incentives matter. For example, when you're in a community and you have a finite number of dollars to invest in all of the things that you need in your community, like healthcare, education, and infrastructure for disaster prevention, you may say, you know, compared to the amount of money that is going to cost to re-outfit all of the houses in my community to be earthquake proof, and the likelihood of an earthquake is going to hit is that high, I'd rather invest these funds in something else like education, healthcare, or business development. I think that people make decisions based on the likelihood of a disaster striking and say that there are better ways in which they can invest limited funds. And that's why we see less of an investment in capacity building. But of course, once a disaster does hit, we have no choice but to invest heavily with dealing with the effects. That is why I believe we see this disconnect between disaster planning and disaster response from a financial standpoint. If it is true that people have less of an incentive to invest heavily in disaster planning and prevention, it is also true that through different levels of society, whether business or government or NGOs, everyone has the incentive to be the first one on the ground. For NGOs or nonprofits, if they are the first ones on the ground, they're more likely to win grants that fund them to do the disaster response work. For corporations that are funding disaster aid and charity, they have the incentive to look the most magnanimous and get the best PR by being the first ones on the ground. And for governments themselves, of course, if governments are quickly to respond, it actually calls into question the legitimacy of the government. So we see things like after Hurricane Katrina, how the people were actually calling in the legitimacy of the governance of New Orleans, and even George Bush asking, at the governance of the United States due to the lack of response in the right aftermath of this event. Each of these different actors, government, business, and NGOs, have an incentive to quickly respond in such that they don't have a strong incentive to prepare very seriously for disasters. Now, what I like to do is to break apart and analyze separately a bit the incentives of the three major actors in disaster aid: governments, corporations, and nonprofit organizations. First, we know that the government are the primary agents charged for protecting people. Here we see the sign for the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. And FEMA is, of course, the agency that responds to disasters in the United States. But all around the world, people expect of their own governments that they are going to represent their interests and protect them when a disaster strikes. The interest of government is to be perceived as competent, speedy, and responding to people's disaster needs. But beyond the interest of the government as a monolithic that is to be perceived as legitimate, it is also true that individual governmental officials have their own interests. Primarily, those interests are involved in earning a salary and having job security. Now, many governmental officials, it is important to acknowledge, are highly trained and have chosen to work for the public sector rather than bring their skills to the private sector because they love their country and believe in their government and are motivated by altruism and a desire to serve. And so we see systematically that government officials are taking salaries that are lower than they could be receiving in the private sector because of their desire to serve. But even granting this motivation towards generosity and altruism that gets many people involved in the government in the first place, it is true that government officials do have some self-interest in guarding their job security and their incomes. Here we see the general schedule which it was organized, the level of those who work in the government, and you can see that this is scheduled from 2011, people who are at grade 15, and step 10, people who are the most highly educated and most experienced, were only earning in 2011 330,000, which really is a small proportion of what people with that skill and grade level could earn in the private sector. You can see visual evidence of both the altruism and the self-interest that is embedded in a governmental job. Many analysts have observed that self-interest of government officials in regards to their behavior in the disaster realm, and they notice two things. One is that by building up people's expectations of people who work in disaster relief, they can make themselves more socially valued and better enumerated. So that means by emphasizing to people in society what you need are disaster experts, what you need is a disaster response team, what you need is a realm analyst of hazard mapping, then these experts, can essentially drive up the value of their services and can drive up their remuneration of the payment they receive for the service. The other place that scholars have noticed self-interest playing out is that we call the reach for long arms of the state. This is not about driving up the value of disaster aid work, but rather it is ubiquity. Analysts have noticed that over time, government bureaucrats have found more and more jobs that are needed to be done to, for instance, count the number of people affected by disaster, count the likelihood of a disaster occurring, doing hazard mapping, doing vulnerability analysis, doing more and more complex planning exercises, and each of these sets of the expertise and skills bring with in a new job and increase job security for people in disaster management. Scholars who work in this area say that over time they have observed the tendency of government officials' self-interest to be manifested in the multiplication of jobs that deal with disaster management and the increased pay for people in some jobs that deal with disaster management. So that sums up the roles of self-interest in government officials' roles in disasters. The next domain that I'd like to address is the domain of non-governmental organizations or nonprofits. There are people that we admire and rely on to come in when no government can save us, when we as community members cannot save ourselves, and as such, people very correctly admire NGOs and their workers. If you know people who work, for instance, in international disaster aid and international development, many of these people are people who have made major sacrifices in their own lives or in their family to live abroad and to do the boots on the ground work that no one else wants to do. We should by no means have our admirations for their sacrifices diminished by what am I about to say in the next couple of slides. While we can recognize the incredibly important work that NGOs and their workers do and the extraordinary sacrifices they've made to protect people, there is also importance to remember that NGO workers have self-interest. Here in this diagram that I have provided, it's a 2014 study of salaries of junior executives in the Philippines, and you can see that the number one highest pay category of junior executives is in the Philippines is the NGO workers, higher than junior executives in IT and software, higher than executives in oil and gas, and even higher than executives in banking, mining, or media. It shows you that even though we have this impression that NGO workers are being low paid and, sacrificing themselves and their families in the field, which is certainly true for some people, there are also some people that are making very high salaries and have self-interest building into the decisions that they make when choosing to engage in nonprofit work. One of the most crucial ways that NGO workers create value both for themselves and for the NGO at large is by delivering results that is showing that they are the first NGO to be on the ground, showing that they are able to get very large grants and invest those grants to make successful development projects, making the big splash in the media and getting a lot of attention for what a great job they have done in development. All of these things are things that drive up the value of the NGO, its ability to get larger and larger grants, and its ability to pay its worker more and more. In the world of NGO, the ability to deliver results and to carry out a project successfully is what really counts financially. Unlike governments, NGOs depend on their donors for funds, and NGOs are often competing with each other to establish outside donors and maintain funds for those projects. In order to outcompete other NGOs, NGOs will show, for instance, that they can be successful, and this involves in spending money, executing projects, and getting press for their work. Anything that allows NGO workers to both bolster the profile in the public of their NGO or to win large grants are things that are incentivized for those NGO workers, because the larger the grant, the more income potentially, and the better argument that they can make that NGO do good work. It is this incentive to compete for funds and to gain more attention for the NGO that sometimes leads also NGOs into the temptation of agreeing to do projects that they are not equipped to do, including take on assignments that they know are not what people in the field need. In this lecture, we have not too extensively explored the self-interest of the people who work in businesses and corporations. And the reason for that is because it is primarily self-evident. Their interest is in making money. However, it is important to notice and mention that there is a component of corporate behavior called corporate social responsibility. So an instance is that most corporations in the United States will engage in some kind of what we call socially responsible behavior in disaster relief and development aid to improve their social image and to make more people open and excited to buy their products. This even happens with a mom and pop shop that might sponsor some community organizations. It is primarily in this way that most businesses and corporations get involved in disaster aid, by giving donations to NGOs and other forms of aid work. In addition to good press that disaster aid can give corporations, and the likelihood that this grants that and the likelihood that this gains them more clients, it is also true that by getting involved in disaster aid corporations, they can sometimes be one of the first groups around the table, and their representatives can get the foot on the door to start supporting reconstruction activities. So that is the other component of self-interest that we see in corporations around disaster aid. Analyzing self-interest in a standalone way in terms of business, governments, or NGO isn't very interesting. What scholars who look at this argue that the very interesting thing happens at the intersection of government, corporations, and NGO self-interest. Anyone who has looked at all into disaster aid knows that these three agencies are meant to be cooperating. In the panel that I have here that comes from Japan Platform, it shows the ways they conceptualize appropriate cooperation between business, government, and NGOs. You can see the businesses are meant to make donations and give relief items to the NGOs, and governments are designed to provide services and human resources or expertise to the NGO. And all of these groups are supposed to support the NGO disbursing relief items, medical treatment, water and sanitation, livelihood recovery, and psychosocial care to the disaster victims. But what happens when we look at the role of self-interest? When we look at the role of the business community, we can see that businesses manifest in a couple of ways. One is that the business community can often try to donate relief items at the lowest cost to itself, but the highest benefit in terms of good press for social responsibility. This is when we see things like corporations donating expired medications, used clothes, or useless items that the disaster victims don't really need. I've argued in this lecture that most of the unjust things that happen at the confluence of businesses, government, and NGO work is about regular people with regular self-interests that are not at all evil or bad actors, just people with self-interest that when it unites, it can have bad outcomes for the disaster victims. That is what I believe is the vast majority of cases where disaster aid goes wrong. But it is abundantly clear that in some cases in which it's not just altruistic behavior with some amount of self-interest that leads to bad outcomes, but actually people who are totally corrupt, who are purposely profiting or being opportunistic, who just want to make an advantage, really take advantage of disaster victims. In the readings, we will see some examples of this, but there are key instances that Naomi Klein is talking about in her book. She is talking about cases in which people come in from the outside and say, oh, there has been a disaster. These people cannot occupy their land anymore. This is perfect opportunity for more to buy it cheap and throw them off their lands and develop it. There are cases in which businesses make the argument that they can provide reconstruction services and win a grant by lowballing governments when they know that. I've argued in this lecture that most of the unjust things that happen at the confluence of business, government, and NGO work is about regular people with regular self-interest that are not at all evil, just people with self-interests, and that can really have bad outcomes for disaster victims. But it is also abundantly clear that in some cases there is not an altruistic behavior, but actually people who are totally corrupt, who are purposely profiting and being opportunistics, who just want to take advantage of disaster victims. In the readings, we will see some examples of this. There are cases in which businesses make the argument that they can provide reconstruction services and win a grant by lowballing governments when they know that they cannot do proper reconstructions and that they are going to use shady materials or shoddy construction practices. Basically, they are scamming the government and winning the subcontracts and not doing the proper work that they're promised to do. Many scholars have observed that there are awful number of cases like this that can be documented in the world of disaster aid and reconstruction. Because we know that these kinds of things occur, we know that there is a certain subset of people who have devolved in disaster aid who are not involved there merely to help disaster victims, but are primarily there to make a profit, to hurt disaster victims, to dispossess them of their land, to look good even when providing donated goods that could hurt disaster victims. We know that this is really important to be vigilant about watching for this in disaster aid sector, particularly identifying it and putting a stop to it. That is one of the reasons why people who are advocates for disaster victims argue for the importance of keeping freedom of the press and academic freedom all around the world. Because we know that if journalists and academics are free to observe and study what is going on in the ground, reporting it and quickly publicizing it, this is likely to help shut down some of these terrible practices. However, when freedom of the press is suppressed and academic freedom is also suppressed, it is much easier for these bad actors, whether it's business or the government or even the nonprofit sector, to cover up their nefarious dealings. At the end of the day, we can never give up self-interest, but we can get rid of these kinds of toxic relationships between business, governments, and NGOs that allow for this self-interest to run rampant. And perhaps one of the best ways of doing this is by making sure that examples of corruption, dispossession, and profiteering are quickly noticed and exposed in the media so that people can respond on the ground and make sure that they stop them. I have argued in this module that there are a number of ways in which disaster aid can go wrong. I have also argued that there is an abundance of evidence in journalism and academic writing that there are some bad actors working in the disaster aid world who are merely looking through corruption, profiting, and dispossession to benefit from the difficulties that disaster victims are suffering. Obviously, there are some of us who are interested in seeking the best possible disaster aid on the ground. And it's important to analyze these situations, identifying them, and really stopping them. At the end of the day, the message of this lecture is not to be a conspiracy theorist, not to be completely against disaster aid either, but rather to be a critical analyst and look what the purpose of a project is in the disaster context and what is both the short-term and long-term consequences for the project beneficiaries. The easiest way to do this is to look for winners and losers. Of course, in many disasters, there's going to be people who are going to profit financially. By looking at those winners and losers, we can examine what if there was even a fair distribution of aid to disaster victims. Did disaster aid projects actually set up the victims up to succeed financially in the long term, to have secure livelihoods? Or do we see a situation in which we see some of these actors, whether business, NGOs, or governments, have really succeeded and enriched themselves at the cost of disaster victims? Being a critical analyst, whether as a citizen or a professional, is something that never goes out of practice in disaster response settings.